5-axis mill I decided to tie with a robotic cell that has 55 pallets or 55 stations. So that would be, in a sense, having the ability to possibly run anywhere from 10 to 60 hours unmanned. So the idea is if we can create another facility that relies more on technology, the revenues can go up. The reliance on human capital isn't so much on being at the facility to push the green button.
Growing a business requires a holistic approach that extends beyond sales and marketing. This approach needs alignment among people, processes, and technologies. So if you're a business owner, operations, or finance leader looking to learn growth strategies from your peers and competitors, you're tuned into the right podcast. Welcome to the WBS Podcast, where scalable growth using business systems is our number one priority. Now, here is your host, Sam Gupta.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the WBS Podcast. I'm Sam Gupta, your host and principal consultant at digital transformation consulting firm Elevate IQ. Prototyping business is unique since each order is different. Most people would not be able to imagine standardization for this business. You may be building parts of different materials, shapes, and sizes and may require different machines and tooling to process the parts. You may also struggle with material storage requirements and might produce several WIP items, as it might be cheaper than ordering each individual part. Given such constraints, how many people would think of implementing robotic cell for a prototyping business? In today's episode, our guest, Brian Kippen, shares his insights on robotic cell technology and how that can be implemented to increase capacity. He also discusses the nuances of the prototyping business and while it might be counterintuitive to implement this technology, he could successfully implement it by standardizing the processes. Finally, he shares his insights into his order-to-cash process and how they segment the materials, assign each job to machines, and share his insights into what would be required to scale the current processes. Let me introduce Brian to you. Brian Kippen has been manufacturing prototypes for 16 years and has owned and operated CAD models and prototypes for over 10 years. Manufacturing complex geometries at a fast pace has been his MO. CAD boasts over 15,000 unique parts manufactured and increasing daily. CAD and Brian has been featured in the Loop, Modern Machine Shop, as well as on the Job Shop Show podcast. With that, let's get to the conversation. Hey Brian, welcome to the show.
Hi Sam, thanks for having me here.
Of course, my pleasure. I am super excited to dig into all of the work that you have done with respect to your robotic cells and the cutting edge stuff that you are doing in your facility. Just to get things off, do you want to start with your personal story and your current focus, Brian?
Absolutely. So my name is Brian Kippen. I own a company called CAD Models and Prototypes. We're primarily focused on producing fast turn prototype parts for companies large and small. For the most part, we're producing these out of every material possible. We don't have a primary focus as far as types of industry that we work with. Our primary focus has always been to get from a concept to a reality.
Okay.
And that varies everywhere from a working, fully functional model to just a component part. For the last 10 years, I've been running the company. In 2019, I decided to expand to a second location on the East Coast. Our primary base has been in the San Francisco Bay Area. Secondary location is now in the Northeast of the United States in Vermont. When I decided to expand, I also decided to change a bit of the technology that we're using.
Okay.
In many ways, your primary use of your equipment, which for us is CNC equipment, is during working hours. And in order to capture more work, I decided to add a robotic cell. That robotic cell allows us to produce parts even at night. And a lot of people say for a prototype machine shop, what good is a robotic cell? What I got to see is the fact that a robotic cell is very much like a cafeteria worker. If you are able to produce your components on a slat bed, a fixed size, you're able to produce any type of component on that. So with redundancy in fixturing, with commonality in fixturing and tooling, you're able to use a robotic cell as a prototype shop and dramatically increase production during the nighttime and weekend hours without increasing substantially the cost of human capital.
Okay, amazing. So great background there. And by the way, I love the way you think you have figured out that, I had to add the second location. And obviously, we are going to dig into a little bit, why you had to do that from the business perspective, why it makes sense to open this in East Coast, and how do you divide the labor. But before we do that, we have one of the standard questions that we ask every single guest. And Brian, that is going to be your perspective on business growth.
So on business growth, I believe that every business owner has the foundation that if they're not growing, they're shrinking.
Yeah.
So the foundational growth for us has always been how to increase revenue without increasing cost exponentially.
Yeah.
In a industry that primarily focuses on technology and highly skilled labor, we all face this labor shortage, especially in the highly skilled sectors. So it's about not only acquiring the best talent that you can, but also training your current talent to be the best that they can be, cross-training, adding new tasks to each individual's list in order to increase the internal growth. So instead of adding 70 or 80 more employees, if you build those employees that you currently have, your productivity is going to increase. The job security for those employees also increases. And then you're able to add more employees, but not at a fast pace. You're adding key components at a slower pace, so you have a higher quality workforce, and that allows you to produce everything that you're trying to do at a higher quality and faster pace.
Okay, amazing. So let's go back to your background. I mean, see, you obviously added the second location. So let's say if we are going back to just one location, so can you describe the thought process in terms of why it was important to add the second location for your business? How did you divide the functions of these locations from the business model perspective? And give us the rundown of what the first location is doing, what second location is doing overall from the part production perspective. What is your distribution model? How are they collaborating? And what has been the thought process in terms of how the second location should come about?
The primary driver for a second location for me was to be able to add staff and to increase the company's productivity. And one of the very difficult things in the San Francisco Bay Area has always been skilled labor. There's a lot of competition for labor, and in the high skilled manufacturing industry, there's the competition is quite great. I would claim that it's a pretty low. There's not a lot of workers in that type of sector. We have in the San Francisco Bay Area, it's incredibly technologically advanced.
Okay.
There is a lot of very smart individuals. And in that, there's also been a drive towards technology, but not necessarily in the manufacturing portions of the technology.
Okay.
If you were to speak to any of the companies that run a manufacturing facility, it's very difficult for them to find talent at the top tier. Yeah. As a prototype company, I primarily need the top tier. I need employees that are willing to work in a fast-paced environment and solve problems quickly. We don't have, as a company, we really don't have operators.
Okay.
It's primarily every employee is a CNC programmer, operator, machinist, problem solver. So when I decided to open the second facility, a good deal of that portion was to expand my customer base, but also to be able to acquire talent in another location. I accidentally chose Vermont, primarily because I grew up in Vermont.
Yeah.
But the accident was just being around for a friend's birthday and finding a building that was for sale, and then running the hypothetical on my way back to the Bay Area. I decided, well, if I'm going to add this, I'm going to need talent. I'm going to need materials. I'm going to need to know if this location is going to be able to have the proper zoning and things like that. The idea of where my customers were going to come from, the primary focus was to be able to expand and better service the West Coast clients, at least to begin with. So I had already had the customer base. I already had the work. It was just about adding the other components. So this all took place at the beginning of 2020, which, as we all know, was not the easiest time to do any type of business. I opened up the facility in January of 2020, took delivery of equipment, and in February returned to the Bay Area in hopes of coming back in late March to Vermont to start the hiring process. That got put on hold until June, primarily because of COVID. And in June, I was able to start hiring. When I was in the Vermont facility in February, Vermont Technical College, which is a local school which has an advanced manufacturing program, had a field trip down to the facility. So I was able to meet with prospective employees. At that point, they were still in school, but I was able to meet with them. Being in a small state, small town, the facility opening up actually brought quite a bit of news publication. Being from the Bay Area, you're kind of seen as a bigger fish in a smaller pond when you come all the way back to a state that has the same population as two towns in the Bay Area. So that allowed the potential, all the potential interlockings to start tying together. The number one thing that California has done is being in the place of the Bay Area, high technology, highly competitive in all sources of technology, consumer electronics, medical device, constantly producing, fast-paced. What that facility is still doing is it's working with a lot of the technology companies in the Bay Area. The primary focus has been turning parts as fast as possible to customer specifications. The Vermont facility was to try to support that when there became slightly higher volumes. But the primary focus was still going to be in maintaining prototype manufacturing. So while California has a facility with 5 employees and 6 CNC machines, Vermont was going to start with more advanced technology. So I purchased 1 vertical 4-axis mill and 1 vertical 5-axis mill. The 5-axis mill I decided to tie with a robotic cell that has 55 pallets or 55 stations. So that would be, in a sense, having the ability to possibly run anywhere from 10 to 60 hours unmanned. So the idea is, if we can create another facility that relies more on technology, the revenues can go up. The reliance on human capital isn't so much on being at the facility to push the green button, as we call. So it quickly became the facility for us that was able to take, say, one complex part and turn that into 5 of the same part overnight, versus our standard facility in California with no robotic cell and also no space to put that cell because the Bay Area has limited space. We are able to then create the same number of parts faster because we don't have to have somebody work from 6 to 10 p.m., placing a piece of material while the machine is already running during the day. We can set up that cell to continue to run at night. So we've given it a name. We call that worker Ripley. Ripley is our robotic cell. And that primarily increases our capacity without increasing the number of pieces of equipment we have to have. If you were to try to run 24 hours during an 8-hour shift, you'd need to have 3 machines. But if you can have that same machine run the 16 hours that unmanned, then you still have the 24 hours, and you just have a greater portion of unmanned hours, which therefore increases revenue without increasing that much. Your payment isn't increasing 3 times.
Right. So some very interesting insights there. So first of all, you have done a lot of research in terms of, coming up with the plan. and that you are able to deliver on that. Most manufacturers that I know, they typically struggle with the execution. Obviously, it's always fun to talk about these technologies, but when you really implement and when you put it to a good use and you are able to make money, obviously that's a differentiator. So before we go any further into this, a lot of our customers may not know what prototype manufacturing is. Okay, so do you want to give a little context in terms of, what kind of parts are we talking about? What kind of applications are we talking about? Which industries, which kind of customers are utilizing your parts so that they have a little context, whether, whatever you have done for your shop, whether it is going to be applicable for them or not.
So our client base is engineering firms, design firms, Fortune 500 companies.
Yeah.
And we're primarily working with them before they're in production. So the concept is there. They want to execute, whether it's a component or an assembly, and they may need 1 or 5. And they may need 1 or 5 in 2 weeks. So it doesn't make sense for them to go to complete production, injection molding, building a tool and realizing that nothing works. So oftentimes, if they need it in a metal component or a specific plastic component, we can oftentimes produce those components faster than injection molding, die casting, and so forth. And if there's a small change in that, because they're working directly with a manufacturing company, we can implement those changes very quickly. So if you're working with an incredibly large manufacturing company that's primary focus is on production, they don't tend to have as many CNC programmers. As a small company with 10 employees, 9 of those employees are CNC programmers. So there's the programmer to machine ratio is just about 1-to-1 at my company.
Okay.
That gives us the ability to turn parts out quickly, to implement changes very quickly, and to be able to produce something that's tangible and in the material specific as quickly as possible.
Okay, so I would need a little bit more context there. So basically, you are saying that you are able to produce these parts far faster than your customers just because, you have far more, let's say, machinists or deprogrammers compared to your customers. So do you have a little bit more background there? Because, when I look at any sort of prototype work, that's not going to be a repetitive work. Obviously, there are going to be a lot of nuances. You have to sort of go through a lot of hoops before you can really produce the part. When you are producing if you have produced a part 5,000 times, then you already know what kind of challenges you are going to face, right? So in your case, why do you believe you are going to be faster than your customers?
So for the most part, I believe that we're faster than a lot of our competitors because we primarily focus on prototypes.
Okay.
So we've produced tens of thousands of prototypes and thousands a year. So when we see a part, we oftentimes know what types of troubles we're going to face. Obviously, no part is the same.
Yeah.
But when you see how much material is removed from one side or the other, you start to be able to figure out where to start. And that comes off of just simply having the experience. A shop that primarily focuses on production oftentimes gets 3 to 6 weeks to produce a single unit. And in that single unit process, they find out typically what's going to happen. Not every piece of material is the same, but you can typically find out what's going to happen, the troubles that you're going to see arise. We're doing that at a lot faster pace. We're trying to do that, figure out what the problems are going to be within the first 5 hours of doing a project. So we can turn parts in 3 to 5 days. So we make mistakes a lot faster. I reward my employees for making mistakes and therefore thereby learning by them and not continuing to make the same ones over and over. What I like to say at the shop is often we do this because we can. If everybody was doing this, if it was easy, everybody would be doing it. It's not easy. It's frustrating. It can be at times expensive. Sometimes you'll get a piece of material that's $1,000 and it will not cooperate the way you foresee. The hope is you don't scrap that piece of material, but every now and then you end up buying a job because of the frustrations. It's few and far between, but these are the things that we're trying to figure out. Our customers know that they're asking for something that's never been done before.
Yeah.
Oftentimes they understand that they're asking for that. There will be some times where a customer does not understand that you don't have a magic wand.
Yeah.
But for the most part, we're pretty good at conveying those things at the beginning of a project. When we see something, we like to say, here's the potential hurdles. Can we make a change? And if it's no, these potential hurdles are going to be there, and you'll have to be able to live with it. If I say something might bow 3 millimeters or an eighth of an inch, chances are it's because I've seen the same thing happen. And every now and then I get lucky and it doesn't. I believe the primary base and the reason why we can turn these things is just due to sheer experience and volume of variety.
Exactly. So when I look at any sort of prototyping work, it's a lot of experimentation, just because you are doing a lot more experimentation and R&D compared to your customer, because they are simply keeping the boat afloat with respect to their operations. They are simply doing the same thing over and over again, and they are trying to be better with that, right? In your case,
correct,
you are seeing a lot more new things, a lot more new materials, a lot more new variables that obviously these companies are not going to see. And that makes you far superior overall in terms of the prototyping business. Now, when I look at the prototyping business, I mean, obviously it's very innovative, it's very R&D driven, right? So when I look at automation, any sort of automation, if you are talking about robotic cell, typically in my mind, and I have spent my life doing the automation, and automation could be in any form, whether you talk about software, hardware, it doesn't matter. Okay, the fundamental principles are going to be always same. Okay, so you automate things that are going to be slightly more repetitive in nature. Okay, the reason why you do that is because if you are going to have too many decision making, if you are going to have too many exceptions in the process, that's probably not a good process or good candidate for automation. So in your business, I see a lot of variables. I see a lot of uncertainties. I see a lot of decision making that your smart, people need to make, and that's why you have the programmer to machine ratio, which is going to be very high. But then you are talking that, I have implemented something which is completely unmanned, which is going to automate some sort of, process. So now robotic cell is not making any sense for your business. So why did you believe that robotic cell was the right fit for your business? And where did you find this process which was the right candidate for the business?
So the argument is something has to be automated and something has to be streamlined in order to make automation valuable. So why not move that further up the chain? So instead of seeing, okay, here are all the variables, which are every single component is going to be different.
Yeah.
But what are the consistencies? Can I move those consistencies up the chain?
Yeah.
So those consistencies become, we have a machine that's a single machine. It has 41 tools in it. And we can then decide that this is going to be a consistency. Of those 41 tools, these 25 will be the same every single time.
Yeah.
And then, so now we've taken one variable out of that, the differential in tooling. We can go further and we can say, okay, the next most complicated thing is how are we going to hold something? If we bring consistency in fixturing, then we reduce one more variable.
Yeah.
So we've set up our machines and we've set up our fixturing to be identical. So on that robotic automation cell, there's 55 locations. Of those 55 locations, 35 are 100% identical.
Okay.
They're all the same pallet and the same fixturing.
Okay.
That is, it comes at a substantial cost when each pallet is $600 and each device is another $1,300. So you have a nice car sitting in there. That does nothing for you except for reduces two incredible variables in manufacturing, work holding and tooling. So from there, during the day, what we can do is if it's a component that we're assigned to build, say 3 or 5 of, first thing in the morning, a machinist gets on that machine or another machine that has the same tooling and proves out their part. Another machinist is doing the same thing on another machine.
Yeah.
So we have 2 machinists or 3 machinists working on each unique part. So at the end of the day, once each machinist has proved out their parts, we then start transitioning things to the robotic cell. And it's the same tooling and it's the same work holding. So it's all about just putting the material in the machine. So we've reduced the 2 main variables in prototype manufacturing down to one variable, which is material size. In changing the work holding, you do have to sometimes look at how you're holding that material in the jaws. So you might have what we consider an op zero, which will make the material fit in the work holding. But from there, the robotic cell is essentially just a cafeteria worker. You're assigning each pallet a program number, which is designated by which is correlates to the part. So at the end of the day, when you activate these pallets with their pieces of material, they're all in the same piece of same work holding, which means our fixture offset is exactly the same, and our tooling is all the same. So the tooling offsets are all the same. So what happens as at night you go home and maybe you have 5 one part, 15 in another, and 2 different parts at different variables, but you've proven out during the day that your process works. So when you hit cycle start in the evening, the machine just continues to prove out what you've already proven prior in the day. Now, there are things that we don't do. We don't do incredibly tight tolerances on one of these when we're doing multiple different parts.
Yeah.
Because if one part has an incredibly tight tolerance for, and the other parts potentially wear those tools, all of your productivity goes out the window. So we make sure that we're keeping some of the tight tolerances for the next morning, where the machine can load those back in, and we can just make sure that our compensations are correct to make sure that our tolerances are right. But when 99% of the manufacturing is done with lights out, that 10% of recovery in the morning or 1% of recovery in the morning does not significantly increase cost.
Okay, so the people who might not be as familiar overall with your business, so let's say if you were to provide them a story, let's say day in the life scenario, and day in the life scenario is going to be that, you are getting a bunch of orders from your customers. You have many different customers, and each of them are going to have, different set of requirements. So maybe talk about, what kind of orders you are getting and how you are sort of eliminating these variables the way you describe the entire order to sort of manufacturing cycle. As you get these order, how do you sort of assign them to different machinists, and then where your robotic cell is going to play the part?
Okay, so which machinist is going to tackle which part primarily has to do with their experience on whether it's materials or complexity. What typically will happen is we have over 60 clients that we primarily work with.
Okay.
In any given week, we're working with 7 of those unique clients.
Okay.
Each one is going to have various materials that they're requesting. So when we're looking at when we're going to automate something, we're looking at stacking the materials. So if we have one client that has 3 different materials and another client that has 5 different materials, we're going to look for to take out the variable. So if we have the machine loaded all with aluminum tooling, we're going to take aluminum parts and we're going to stack them. So our machinists, we have gone down to very simple structures for job tracking. We just simply have a clipboard. I've tried automating that. It gets complicated.
Yeah.
A tangible item in some ways is one of your best friends. So a machinist will have that. We'll have a coordination meeting where we'll talk about what needs to be done and how fast.
Yeah.
And we'll look at what similarities we each have. So from there, that's where we would start a day or start a week, depending on the complexity of the part. Some of our parts may take an entire day to program, and you wouldn't start to machine until the following day. But we try to get as many of these components that are similar in materials together at the beginning of each day. And we stagger who is going to prove out on what machine is available.
Okay.
So the robotic cell is tied to a 5-axis machine.
Yeah.
The beautiful thing about a 5-axis machine is it's also a 3-axis machine.
Yeah.
So we don't have to limit that to complex parts. It's very simple for that machine to do simple parts, just a lot more of them without interfacing or tying a body to that. So once we have the system set up in the morning of what part is the most complicated, what's going to take the longest time to prove out.
Yeah.
And if that's going to be requiring a 5-axis machine, we make sure that machinist is assigned to a 5-axis machine. Same thing happens when it's a 3-axis machine that's required, but there's more parts. We try to find out how many pieces of material, how many parts we can get per night. Because if you can stack your machine and it's going to run for 22 hours on one part, but only 30 minutes on another, it doesn't make a lot of sense to stack it with the 30 hours at night if you can get more of an individual component, because ideally the thing that sells and the thing that you get paid for is the finished component. Doesn't matter how many parts you program, doesn't matter how many parts you quote, you're only getting paid for what you ship.
Yeah.
So if you're able to capture, say, 12 hours of cycle time lights out and you have 15 completed parts, that's a lot better and more cost effective than a weeknight turning of something that's going to run continuously throughout the day. So you also stagger the time. So when you prove out your single part, you're also gauging what your cycle time is. So if you have 15 parts that take 20 minutes each, the math is quite simple. You have 300 minutes or 5 hours of cycle time that you can capture for that unique part. So these are the types of things that we kind of go over. I do this process very quickly in my head, and I help assign things at night and stagger things for our machinists in order for them to be able to be most productive and the machine to be most productive.
Okay, so you mentioned a couple of terms there, and I don't know how many executives are going to be really familiar with the manufacturing. Obviously, they don't spend as much time on the shop floor, so it'll be beneficial for them describing the process of stacking. And I don't know if you're going to have any sort of examples there. So help me understand. Okay, so when you say process of stacking, are you trying to identify the common parts that are going to be across the orders? You are trying to put them and then assign to the right machine and the right machinist? Is that what you are trying
Correct.
to do?
I'm trying to get the most variables out of the process. So instead of having automation run stainless steel, plastic, and aluminum, the way I'm stacking it is I'm stacking all the aluminum parts together, all of the plastic parts together, all the steel parts together. That way we aren't changing tools, scrapping material, literally binning it, throwing it away. There's not a ton of money in recycling, but there is a bit of a feel good about recycling scrap.
Yeah.
And you might be able to get a cheeseburger. So there is something about that. And then at times I will not run very complex or high volume removal steel parts in automation just for the risk of tool breakage. You're able to make sure that the machine stops and doesn't break everything. But a lot of times what that'll do is it'll halt production. So a lot of the steel will change that process and oftentimes do that during the day, or do a lot of the roughing, high material removal rates in the evening and stagger those parts so that we're not putting too much burden on the machine for potential catastrophic failure. But so our stacking will primarily for automation be with the more simple materials, the materials that are not going to be high risk for damaging tooling, because it for us doesn't make a ton of sense to set something lights out and come back and it's got through one part because the tool breaks.
Okay, so provide some more examples of the tooling breakage. So let's say what are different materials? Can you name them? How you are going to segment these? Describe a little bit more.
So if you're cutting a very rigid material such as stainless steel, and you're using tooling that potentially could break, automation will check tooling. You can have the automation go through and check that the tool is still there at the end of a cut to make sure that it didn't remove itself from the cycle and thereby potentially removing every other tool that's smaller than that comes. Oftentimes with machining, you start with your largest tool, you remove the most of the material, and from there you step down until you have your finished part. Now, if your first tool, which is doing your primary roughing, breaks, and you don't have automation checking, then every single tool that comes after that will break. And if you have automation and you're not checking the tool, you can make 25 scrap parts just as fast as you can make 25 good parts. The beautiful thing is when you scrap a tool and then you break everything, you just come back with, it looks like nothing happened overnight except for your automation says, I'm complete with my task. So it's very important for you to also put in these redundancies and checks when you're doing complex or hard machining. So that's why we oftentimes will leave the complex hard machining to be completely verified during the day and maybe do a primary roughing cycle, which the removal of a lot of material can take quite some time. So if you start putting in redundancies for your tooling, and say you figured out that a tool will last for 3 parts, in your automation, you say for the first 2 parts, we'll use this tool. And then for the next 2 parts, we'll use this tool, so that you're guaranteed not to have a problem at night. And those things can only really be discovered after you cycle more than once. For us, because we're primarily doing prototype, at that point, we're typically done with that project. So oftentimes the more complex rigid materials, we're not as effective with the automation, but we know that. So we capitalize other ways by taking out the complexity and using the automation for the easy stuff.
Okay. How are you doing your inventory planning? So in this particular case, obviously each part is probably going to be unique. I don't know. You are definitely trying to remove some of the variables from the equation, and you are trying to find similarities. So are there any specific inventory items that are consistent across your orders? Do you plan them in advance? Do you buy them? What do you buy? How is your inventory valued and recognized?
So our inventory, as far as tooling goes, because we have a common tool list in all of our machines, the tooling is quite simple. We have a list of tooling that goes in every machine, so that's very easy to inventory. The complexity becomes the raw stock. In order to be able to produce a whole swath of different shapes, sizes, you need to be able to start with either a whole bunch of shapes or sizes or very large pieces of material. So what we've done is we buy large pieces of material, and we have the equipment to cut it down into smaller pieces. Now, what happens with many companies is they don't have the ability to process raw material, or they don't have the manpower to process raw material, because it all takes time. In prototyping, you need the raw material, because if you're going to be first and you're going to be finished, you need to be able to process something. It takes anywhere from 1 day to 7 days to get material. So if you had one piece of material that was, say, 3 by 3 by 3, you could order it from McMaster-Carr, which is very easy to do. It's a little bit more expensive. It usually arrives the next day. That's fine. But the next day at times can be too long of a wait. So if you have one piece of material on your shop floor that's 3 inch by 3 inch thick, 16 inches long, and 4 feet wide, you can process that as long as you have the equipment to cut it. So I've also invested in equipment for cutting materials. We have an automated bandsaw, which allows us to produce multiples of one, or just produce one of something. That gives us the ability to turn things slightly faster. But our typical material order will be various sheet sizes and common bar stock, which we often use, whether it's steel, stainless steel, or aluminum, and then also with plastic. So we're oftentimes making sure that we have inventory of raw stock in large shapes and sizes on the floor. It's very easy to make a big piece of material into a small piece of material. You just can't do it the other way. So that's one of the main objectives for us, is having inventory, but having what could be considered large amounts of inventory if you didn't have the processing capabilities.
Okay. So I am going to ask you one more question. So let's say right now you have 2 locations, and let's say if I give you 10 more locations and give you enough money to be able to open those locations, what will be your process of scaling these locations? Do you feel confident in terms of your current processes or the systems? Can you scale to 10 locations?
I believe that I could scale to 10 locations. The obvious number one issue is going to be the human. In order to be able to produce things quickly, you need to have great talent. So those locations wouldn't be arbitrary locations. I probably wouldn't choose Antarctica for one of them. Material accessibility, UPS and FedEx, probably not so good. So things along those terms. But the processes that I have created, and I have been able to scale to a second location. I believe a third, fourth, and fifth location would just become easier, so long that I have access to the people. If you were to tell me that you're going to give me 5 different places that you're going to assign those locations to me, we'll have to sit down and have a conversation, because this is not Survivor.
All right, brother, that's it for today. Do you have any last-minute closing thoughts or remarks for our listeners?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that you need to be aware of is the fear of new technology doesn't only goes as far as the fear itself. So in looking at how technology is primarily used, you need to start thinking about how it's used secondarily, or what other ways that you can use that technology to better service your company, your industry, the types of work that you're doing, and not think about technically how it's sold. Obviously, you're going to use a car to go down the street, but you don't have to. You could use your car to go to the racetrack. You could use your car to do all sorts of things. The primary use of technology is often sold for its most often purpose. So automation has always been sold for production. It doesn't have to be. It's just the way of thinking. So it's what we've done is we've taken the automation, we utilize that automation, but we've decided to take so many of the variables and put them in a different location. And that can be done with a lot of different types of technology. And it's about trying to figure out what works for you, and thinking outside of the box as a business owner or somebody who's running a sector of a business is sometimes the most complicated because there's so much information on what's typically done and not very much information on what's not typically done. So I think that the best thing to do is when you look at a piece of equipment, you look at a piece of technology, a piece of software, and if you don't have the exact use for that, but you have something that you believe that it could be used for, do all the research that you can, figure out how to use that software in a way that works best for you. And if it doesn't work for you, that's not your piece of software, not your piece of technology. But if you have an idea and you hear one key phrase by a salesperson about utilization or what that piece of software or technology does, maybe it's time to extrapolate and see if you can make that piece of technology work for you instead of it working for that salesman.
Okay, amazing. And my personal takeaway from this conversation is going to be any automation or technology, if you plan to choose, first understand your business at the foundational level and figure out what are going to be the repetitive processes that you might be able to automate. So understanding and have the mastery of processes is far more important than utilizing the technology. But if there is a chance and opportunities to be able to utilize the technology, go for it, but understand your business model first. On that note, I really want to thank you for your time, Brian. This has been a powerful episode.
Thanks, Sam. Have a good day.
I cannot thank our guests enough for coming on the show, for sharing their knowledge and journey. I always pick up learnings from our guests, and hopefully you learned something new today. If you want to learn more about Brian, head over to cadmodels.com. It's KADMODELS.com. Links and more information will also be available in the show notes. If anything in this podcast resonated with you and your business, you might want to check other related episodes, including the interview with Anisa Muttana, who shares her journey of transforming her shop after losing all of her key customers because of the consolidation in her customers' industries. Also, the interview with Jennifer Bannock-Bloomer, who discusses how machines think and why that matters to the machine shops. Also, don't forget to subscribe and spread the word among folks with similar backgrounds. If you have any questions or comments about the show, please review and rate us on your favorite podcasting platform or DM me on any social channels. I'll try my best to respond personally and make sure you get help. Thank you, and I hope to catch you on the next episode of the WBS Podcast.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the WBS Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. For more information on growth strategies for SMBs using ERP and digital transformation, check out our community at WBS.rocks. We'll see you next time.